Hello, good morning everyone, Rich here, welcome back to the channel. The lens we are looking at today is a super compact ultra wide angle lens. This is the Laowa 15mm f5 Cookie lens. It is a manual-focus lens designed for full-frame mirrorless cameras. The lens is available for Sony E, Canon RF, Nikon Z, Leica L as well as the Leica M mount. The sample I received from Laowa is for the Nikon Z mount, but optically it is the same for all the different versions. The only difference between all the different versions is the Sony E mount, the aperture is electronically controlled, which means you can control the aperture value directly from the camera, and the photo you shot would also have the lens information, including the aperture value you choose or store in the EXIF data. While the Canon RF, Nikon Z, Leica L and M version, the aperture is purely mechanical and there is no electronic chips, so the EXIF data doesn't contain any of the lens information. A 15mm full-frame lens is pretty wide. The field of view is 110 degrees. However, unlike the typical ultra-wide-angle lenses that are usually pretty big and heavy, this lens is just so tiny, and that's why Laowa put it under their Cookie series. Now, while the lens is probably a little bit bigger than an actual Cookie, but it is still really compact and it looks very cute. The front element is also very small and the front filter thread is only 39mm. Yes, there is a front filter thread and you should be able to install a front filter to this ultra wide angle lens. I haven't got any 39mm filter myself, so I can't really tell you if adding a filter would introduce any vignetting or not. The lens comes with a removable rectangular shaped lens hood that looks very nice. It's made of plastic, but it clicks onto the lens very securely. With the lens hood installed, you can still put the lens cap back onto the lens, but it will be slightly harder. The lens itself is made of metal and it feels very solid. Laowa's official figure says the lens is approximately 160 grams without any of the lens cap. I measured my Nikon Z mount version, which I think has the biggest mount, and it is about 155 grams, so it is super lightweight. I think I have already mentioned this lens is very compact, but I really have to say it again because it is just a super compact lens. Because of that, this lens is just very easy to carry around. Apart from the Sony E version, all the other versions, there is a mechanical aperture ring at the front of the lens. It has clicks and there is a total of 6 clicks from the maximum aperture f5 to minimum aperture f22. The Sony version doesn't have the aperture ring because the aperture is controlled electronically from the camera. The manual focus ring is just behind the aperture ring. The focus ring is smooth and the focus flow is approximately 90 degrees, which is pretty short, but it is not really a problem because the depth of field is so deep, so you don't really need to focus precisely. Most of the time when I'm shooting on the street, I just set the focus to around 3 meters and I rarely have to adjust the focus. And because the lens is so small, so Laowa has added a tab to the focus ring to allow easy focus adjustment. With this lens mounted on my Nikon Z6, it is a pretty lightweight and also compact combo that I can carry around with me every day very easily, but I think it will be even better on a smaller body like the Sony A7C or a Leica M, and you have a super compact setup. With this lens being so small, I do expect there will be some compromises in terms of image quality. So let's find out what the photo and video quality is like, and if there is any sacrifice in terms of image quality. Let's start with the image sharpness first, and let's zoom into the center of the photo. At the maximum aperture f5, the center is already very sharp. Because of that, stopping down the lens doesn't really improve the center sharpness much at all. The center becomes sharpest at f8. After that, diffraction was starting to take away a bit of center sharpness. And let's have a look at the corner now. At f5, the corner sharpness is actually quite acceptable. While I won't say it is very sharp, but I think it is usable. Stopping down to f5.6 or f8, and I can see some improvements in the corner sharpness. This Laowa lens has pretty good close-up shooting capability. The minimum focus of this lens is only 12 cm, and that gives you 0.2 times maximum magnification. Luckily, because the size of the lens is quite small and it also has a small front element, so even when you're shooting at the minimum focus distance, the lens won't easily cast shadow onto your subject, unlike some other ultra wide angle lenses that has a big front element that would easily cast shadow onto your subject. The sharpness when shooting at the minimum focus distance is also decent. Very acceptable even at f5, and it will improve slightly as you stop down the lens a bit. Since this is an ultra wide angle lens and the maximum aperture is f5, so you don't really get shadow depth of field when shooting with this lens. However, since the focus distance can be as close as 12 cm, so you could still dissolve the background a bit when you are shooting very close subjects. When you do that, the background bokeh looks alright, nothing too special to be honest, but it's also not too distracting. Since this lens has a 5 aperture braid design, so once you stop down the lens slightly, the bokeh balls would turn into pentagon shape quickly. Let's have a look at the vignetting test photos now. At the maximum aperture f5, there is quite a bit of vignetting, especially at the very corner. There is some pretty noticeable light fall off. This is pretty much expected as it's such a compact ultra wide angle lens. Stopping down the lens would only reduce the amount of vignetting a little bit. Even when I stop down all the way to the minimum aperture f22, there is still some quite noticeable vignetting. Looking at the real world photos that I've shot with this Laowa lens, I don't notice too much chromatic aberration. Most of the photos have very minimal amount of color fringing, even when I zoom into some high contrast areas. Laowa does not market this lens as a 0D lens, and I'm not really surprised by that. With such a compact design and the 15mm focal length, it would be really hard to have zero or near zero distortion. Look at this brick wall photo. We can see a bit of distortion near the edge of the frame. To be honest, it's really not bad. Consider the lens has such a wide focal length and the camera has applied no software distortion correction. But if you want to use this lens to take photos when there are straight lines near the edge of the frame, be prepared you need to apply a bit of correction to reduce the amount of distortion. With such a wide angle lens, lens flare performance is quite important, as quite easily you could have some strong light source in front of the camera, especially if you are shooting landscape photos. Fortunately, the lens flare performance of this lens is pretty decent. There really isn't too much lens flare at all, even when I'm shooting directly into the sun. Not much ghosting and the contrast remains very good. This is probably the best lens flare performance I have seen from a Laowa lens so far, so it's good to see Laowa is improving in this area. Laowa's ultra wide angle lenses pretty much always have the 5 aperture braid design, and this is the same for this 15mm cookie lens. You only need to stop down the lens slightly to f5.6 and you can already see the 10-point Sunstars in your photos. Stopping down the lens to f8, then the Sunstars become very sharp and beautiful. Sunstars remains very similar, only slightly sharper and longer tail as you stop down the lens all the way to the minimum aperture f22. In terms of focus briefing, in my usual 1 meter to infinity focus briefing test, there is very minimal amount of focus briefing, almost non-noticeable. Only when I change the focus to around 0.5 meter or closer, then I will see some focus briefing. So for most of the normal video shooting, you won't notice any focus briefing issue. Lens design is always about compromises. So with such a small ultra wide angle lens, I do expect there will be quite a few compromises. So one compromise is the slow f5 maximum aperture, which is not too big a issue as most people would just use this lens to take some landscape photo or just take some random photo on the street that doesn't really need shadow depth of field, and our camera's high ISO performance is really good these days, so it's not a problem if we have to raise the ISO a little bit. So my main concern is how much would the small size affect the image quality? Turns out the image quality is not bad overall. Sharpness, chromatic aberration, Sunstars, lens flare are all quite good. There is a bit of distortion. Vignetting is the weakest area, but I think it's still not terrible. While we all want lenses that give us perfect image quality, the problem with those lenses is that they are usually quite big and heavy and of course expensive as well. So even if we bought it, we may not carry them with us all the time because of the weight and size, so the lens may just sitting at home. With this Laowa lens, while the image quality I won't say is excellent, I think most people, including myself, would still be pretty happy with the photos captured by this lens. And the best thing is, because it's so small and lightweight, if you are someone who loves to shoot with an ultra wide angle lens but just don't like to carry the typical big and heavy ultra wide angle lens, now you could just mount this Laowa lens on your camera and carry it around as an everyday lens because it's just such a small and lightweight lens. Or if you're someone who don't usually shoot with an ultra wide angle lens every day, you could just chuck it into your camera bag and carry it with you all the time because it barely adds any weight to your camera bag. And when you suddenly found something that you want to shoot with an ultra wide angle lens, yep, you got this ultra wide angle lens in your camera bag. Chase Jarvis once said, "The best camera is the one that's with you." And now I'll tell you, the best lens is the one that's with you.